Right. So welcome. Thank you all for joining this session today. My name is Vera. I'm an instructional equity partner at Highlander Institute based in Providence, but working with schools in different regions of the United States. If you want to get in contact with me or follow up with anything later, my contact info is in the this first slide here. I'm not super active on Twitter, but I do have one, so I have it on there, as well as our organization's Twitter handle as well. So a little bit of background, and I'd love to, if you feel moved to, it's a small enough group today, just introduce yourself and maybe your specific lane or role in education. For me, as I mentioned, I work for Highlander, which is a nonprofit focused on educational equity. This is my 6th year now here, but previously was an 8th grade math teacher in Central Falls, Rhode Island, if anyone is familiar with the district. And really excited to have this conversation with you all. If anyone feels moved to, you can unmute as well, but if you're more comfortable introducing yourself in the chat, that is perfectly fine. Liz, nice to meet you. Oh, wow. All right, coming in. Julie. Malia or Amalia. Thank you, Elliot. Well, folks can feel free to continue introducing yourselves. Wonderful. We have such a variety of education and education adjacent folks here. Excellent. I will try to keep this as relevant to multiple roles within education as possible. Continuous improvement. Awesome. Happy to have you all. Thank you. I might not be able to read everyone's right now, but I will definitely catch up and see who's in our room as we move along. So for anyone who's not familiar with Highlander, we partner with schools and we use that term loosely, right? The school community includes parents, parents and families, other community members, teachers, staff of all kinds, and ideally we partner indirectly with students by centering their voices in a lot of our work with the hope that we're all working together to have classrooms that empower every learner, schools that are adaptable. I think we've seen the need for incredible real-time adaptiveness over the past few years, and systems that hopefully will ultimately liberate us all. Lofty goal, but that is what we aim to do. And as for our session today, I'll talk a little bit about some of the context and the research behind some of the work that we do with schools, specific to sort of these two practices, cultivating relationships and developing academic mindset. And then we'll spend a good chunk of our time doing a tiny data study. There's a little sampling of some data we have with our student experience survey that we launched a couple of years ago. And we'll talk about what we see, what that makes us think or wonder, and what action that might inspire if you were looking at data in your own context. And then I do feel that storytelling is one of the most powerful ways that we foster understanding and hopefully build a future together that is more equitable for those who we care about, right? The students that we ultimately serve. And so we'll tell the story of how one of our school partners sort of went on this journey using sort of student surveys as their starting point to help make school better, you know, starting with the kids who are experiencing it every single day. Are there any questions or requests in the chat for things that you want to hopefully make connections to or hear about specifically? Of course, as questions come up, please do drop them in the chat. So some framing for the ways that we partner with schools. If we think about the sort of overarching umbrella is a school change model, right? I saw continuous improvement coordinator is like one of the titles in here. Very excited to see that continuous improvement is really what drives our work. So the idea that schools in many ways systemically have stayed pretty static, not all, but that change is something that requires some nuance, some sensitivity, and ideally a dependable process if we're going to get teachers and everybody else across the school community on board. And so with our attention to cultural responsiveness, there's sort of, we'll talk about the inclusive change process. So what does it mean to sort of convene a design team of stakeholders from all these different levels of sort of student engagement within the school day. And then the CRISP, what we call it, culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy. So what are the specific practices, both teacher and student, that we hope to see more of in practice. And then we'll talk about our approach to liberatory data. And one of our first tools that we developed is that student experience survey that I mentioned earlier. So this is our framework that is really the foundation of all of our work. You'll notice the 4 domains starting at awareness. So when we coach teachers directly, as we work with school leaders to drive their school improvement team initiatives, we've got sort of the building of sociocultural awareness in domain 1. So who are all of the students that we serve? What are the unique lived experiences that they bring with them to our community? And also awareness of who's carrying the cognitive load. So really attending to student expectations, who's doing the heavy lifting, so to speak. And so when we do that reflection with teachers, often they'll have that aha moment of like, you know what, I'm having them engage in or finish tasks, but they're not actually owning the pieces that I would love for them to take some leadership in. And then that second domain, we really attend to community building throughout the year as we work with teachers, but sort of the prerequisite before we can get into the cognitive development work in that third domain is creating that at the very baseline, a sense of trust and belonging. And also a lot of our academic mindset work lives in that domain. So we'll talk about that in particular, because that was a focus area for the school in the Midwest that I'll be sharing about later. And then ultimately, we hope that we're doing all of this work in service of a better society for all, right? So the idea that critical consciousness is providing the exposure, skills, and empathy building for our students to be able to identify systems where they are within them, and to recognize when it's not working for everybody. What is something that I personally feel moved to do, and what are my unique skills, strengths, and inclinations that would help me determine how to make the world somehow, hopefully better, starting with my own community. So that is really the center of our work at every level: teachers, administrators, families, etc. This is a very text-heavy slide, so I'll let folks read it if they want to. I won't read it out loud. I'll just sort of call out one of the ways that we see the interplay of both academic outcomes and some of the more social emotional learning focused aspects of our work. Is that when focused on improving math scores in one of our schools, really like taking a look at math instruction. How is it happening? Is it inclusive? How much of the discourse is teacher driven, or is it student led? Are they making sense and meaning together? When we focused on that, we also focused on, of course, those first 2 domains, awareness and community building. And for those students, we saw an increase for 68% of them reporting a deeper sense of belonging, and 60% of them reporting sort of higher academic confidence. And then to see the improvement in their iReady math assessment performance levels sort of points us in the direction of, attending to community and belonging is always in service of ultimate academic outcomes as well. So some of the research that was instrumental in our shift, because we didn't start out at Highlander really having that culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy framework. We largely started with supporting personalized learning shifts in schools, and this is very much, this has grown out of that. So we're thinking about, if cultivating individual relationships with students is what we're hoping teachers will invest in, then the ways that we sort of frame that for them is using some of these research connections that have come before us, right? So for middle school students who reported strong relationships with their teachers, they were 8 times more likely to stick with challenging tasks rather than sort of disengaging or giving up. And if you're curious, there's a link within the slide deck to our website, and you can find more information about the studies that we cite. And then also you'll see here that sadly, in a survey for across 6 through 12, less than 33% of middle schoolers felt that they had a strong relationship with their teachers. And then that number dropped to 16% by 12th grade. So we see this sort of challenge compounding over the years. And as we see in many measures, as far as the ways that school can be equitable or inequitable, students from low-income backgrounds generally reported even fewer strong relationships with their teachers. And that certainly comes into play in the school story that we'll be sharing. And then the other practice we mentioned beyond cultivating individual relationships is investing the time in developing positive academic mindsets. So this is just, probably nothing new to you all as far as the importance of really intentionally naming and exercising or building academic mindsets in the classroom. But for anyone who's been a teacher, there is so much pressure to keep up with the pace of content that often some of these more transferable skills end up on the back burner or being deprioritized. And so sort of holding the tension there with teachers, right? That there's this pressure to get through the content and focus on the curriculum as sort of prescribed, but then also finding ways to preserve time for these conversations. What is academic mindset, right? And so we did that. We had our teachers do that with their students, and you'll see in a moment the slides and components of academic mindset that they were working on. So from the Chicago Consortium in 2012, we referenced these 4 components of academic mindset, and teachers and principals will often pick one to focus on at first. And so these are they're all equally important, right? But the idea that just like in our framework, a sense of belongingness is necessary if we want students to take the risks, those academic risks with each other. They have to feel safe and like it's worthwhile. Also that personal sense that I can actually improve. For a lot of students in historically marginalized populations, they may or may not have something to point to in their prior education experience where I did struggle through something, I stuck with it, and it was worthwhile. And so if that hasn't happened for them yet, it's a really hard sell, right? To have them stick with a task. And we hear that from teachers all the time. We're like, it gets hard and then they give up. So thinking about how we can really shift that mindset for all students, the idea that smart isn't something you just are, it is a practice that we all can continue to work on every single day. And then similarly, the belief that I can actually succeed at this, and it's within my abilities, and I have the tools and resources that I need to see this through. And then this piece, this work has value for me. Anyone who's ever worked in middle school like I have, you're probably familiar with the question, like, why should this matter to me? I got that all the time in 8th grade math. And so I think the more that we can be explicit about that, and the more that we can have students hopefully do the hard thinking of making meaning and finding purpose, the more engaged, hopefully, they will be in the work. It does require a relinquishing of control as teachers. So there is a link in the slides as well if you want to see the full list of questions in our student experience survey. And we are an open ed resource org, so please feel free to borrow, take, use, adapt. We hope that the work that we do will ultimately benefit everybody who's looking for some of these tools. So feel free to reference that. But when we look at the data set in a moment, I ask you to sort of try on this See, Think, Wonder, Inspire protocol. And it's a really simple one. It's especially a great tool to use with if you're ever doing professional development with staff. We often start here, especially if there isn't really a culture around looking at data yet. It's sort of a low stakes way to have everybody be able to like point to something, share initial analysis, and maybe propose some action steps. So we do this with parents as well. So I mentioned design teams. We have design teams that have representation from teachers, from parents of students, family members of students, and community members. And so because not everybody has necessarily experience looking at educational data, this is one of the ways that we sort of have the conversation with everybody. So you can, as you look at the data, you can type in the chat or unmute and share, because I'd love to hear someone else's voice. But what do you see? Something you can point to? What does it make you think or wonder? Does it elicit additional questions, or is there an inference that you're beginning to make? And then lastly, if this were data from your own school context, what action might you take after seeing this data? Our survey is administered to grades 3 and up. We do have some schools that opt for a K-2 friendly kind of, you can call it an informal focus group. It's a little bit more facilitated and there's less, it's less verbally dependent. So we have students with, will like point to a smiley face, neutral face, or a universal frowny face for some of these questions. And the teacher might read them to the student directly rather than having them complete this on their computers on their own. But every question is either on a frequency scale or a truthfulness scale. And so you'll see the deeper blue, the more consistently it's happening, and the darker orange, the less frequently, or perhaps it's not even within the student's awareness at this point because those conversations haven't happened. So perhaps the terminology is not familiar. So these questions have evolved a little bit over time. We work with a psychometrician to really formulate questions that hopefully are landing with the age group that we are working with, and also periodically test for reliability and validity with student advisory groups. So this is from a couple years ago. So 2020 to 2021 was when we launched this survey. And so the way that we can look at this data set, you have the specific questions on the left here. We picked just a sampling of a few where there were some noticeable distinctions between subgroups or different demographic populations. So in this first table here, you'll see where it says MLL and not MLL. That stands for whether they're designated as a multilingual learner student or if they are not. And then BOY just stands for beginning of the year. This is a fall administration of the survey. Typically schools give it once in the fall and once in the spring. And as you're looking at this, you'll see the next table, IEP/special ed. So does the student have an IEP, or are they designated as special ed? And then in the right-hand column, students who are in the general ed population. And then that last table is socioeconomic status. So do they qualify for free lunch? Then those numbers are on the left here, and then paid lunch is on the right. So I will give you a moment to just look at the data set, orient yourself with the populations that are represented here in this quick snapshot, and hopefully start typing in the chat or unmuting to share your see, think, wonder. So what's something you see? What does that make you think or wonder? And what action might you take, even if it's to gather more information, specific information? What would your next step be if you were looking at your school's data and this is what you saw? You can start with informal noticings, right? If it's a little daunting to answer all of those prompts, just call out something that you see. It doesn't have to have, you don't have to include your inference, but you can. Thank you, Elliot. Multilingual learners on average scored lower. Indeed, for my intelligence is something that I can change. Teachers. Yes, glad that I'm their student. Yes. Teachers try to get to know me. Yes, I am. Eric, I'm glad you called that out, the gap between those two related questions, right? My teacher has tried to get to know me, and my teacher is glad I am their student. I'm going to hold on to that because that is actually one of the pieces that the school that I'll be talking about noticed in their data set as well. So this is just a sampling from various schools in that first year of survey administration, but we'll see some school specific data in a moment. The group sizes in the last year much closer. Yes, yes. Thank you, Janelle. Looking at the N sizes. So for, there is much, the numbers are much closer, right? As far as socioeconomic status in that last table, it's a little bit closer to half and half. Any wonderings, questions, inferences? Based off of what you've noticed. If you're just taking a minute, no worries. Ooh, wondering how the teachers school reacted to the data. Liz, I love it. I couldn't have asked for a better transition. We will talk a little bit about one school's response after looking at the data as a staff. So it's hopefully helpful to think of this as a frame. So if we think about what is the problem we identified by looking at data as a starting point, what potential solutions did teachers who were working with us implement? And then how did we revisit data to understand the impact of those changes? And then lastly, what are some ways that the school was able to scale what we learned was valuable and successful for their particular group of students. So in this school that I mentioned in the Midwest, they noticed that all average scores across all domains of questions were lower for students who qualify for free or reduced lunch when compared to their peers who are not socioeconomically disadvantaged. And so there were 6 pilot teachers or a cohort of teachers that were receiving coaching that year. So they were the first ones to see the school data, but they also were the only ones to see their own teacher level data. So when we report out these responses to the survey, we do want to protect teacher privacy and prevent folks from sort of comparing themselves to each other, because that can sometimes not be constructive. So one thing that we sort of name as a best practice, if you are going to administer a survey like this in your context, is that we share aggregate data with everyone, and then only the individual teacher, especially if they request it, will see their own specific individual data. So these are some of the discrepancies we saw in the ways that students responded to these questions. So if you want to take a moment, so FRPL is their designation for free or reduced price lunch, and then paid lunch is in the right-hand column there. And you'll see there are some questions that students across the board scored pretty low for their school. And so after sort of digesting this data, it really was moving to pilot teachers, especially because in this particular district, several of the teachers went to that school when they were students, and so it's a hard pill to swallow, right? And I think holding that with empathy for teachers who are doing everything they can to see that despite your best intentions, school may not be as happy of a place, as successful and safe of a place for all of your students. And so they prioritized having transparent conversations with their individual classes about the student experience survey questions. That was sort of their first step. And for them, the pairing of questions, they were curious about my teacher, let's see, has tried to get to know me. So they wanted to ask their students, what does it mean and what is your comfort level, right? Like not everyone wants to share personal information, but at the same time, we want you to know that like I do care about you as an individual. So they had conversations with their advisories and with their individual classes. What would it look like for a teacher to try to get to know you in a meaningful way? What would it look like for me to make you feel proud of who you are, where you live, and where your family is from? So just really asking more questions is where they started. And that wasn't really a practice of like deliberately collecting student input and feedback. So that was sort of their first step was, can I get more clarity and a deeper understanding of how my students are interpreting these questions and what their responses actually mean? And then realizing that relationship building across the board was an area for us to grow. One small strategy really started with just like a teacher saying, and many of us hopefully have done this, right? Standing at the doorway. She's like, no matter what, every day, greeting each individual student. Sometimes when you have a classroom of 30 and you have like 6 different classes, that can be the thing, right? That kind of falls off, right? And so she said, no matter what, even if we have a hard day, I told them like, we're going to have, I'll be happy to see you and I'll send you off lovingly when you leave my class. And then from there, they started having deeper conversations with individual students. So they did some academic goal setting with students now that they have sort of that initial relationship established. And then the teachers in this pilot created a schedule to have one-on-one data conferences with their students so that they can start creating these positive feedback loops, right? Like even if it's in a micro way, here's a small example of like you persevered through something, here's where you were, here's your data now, creating a new story for students who maybe historically have felt like school is always hard and I never succeed, I never catch up, why bother continuing to try? So these were the aspects of academic mindset that they were really focused on. Fostering that belief that my individual ability and competence will grow with continued effort, and that I belong to not just my community, but truly this is an academic community. We take intellectual risks together, we look at data together, and we are successful when all of us are successful. And that is the approach that this particular teacher took with her students. So I think I mention her first name, just it's easier. So Lori was really working on building academic mindsets in her classroom and fostering that sense of community. So her focus was on building relationships and designing opportunities for reflection in her classroom. So she shared the student experience survey data on sort of the smart board for everyone to see. She asked the whole class some follow-up questions, as mentioned, to deepen her understanding. For her, there was, my teacher respects me, or my teacher treats me with respect, excuse me, was rated very highly, but my teacher is glad I am their student, was on the opposite end of the spectrum of scores. And so she asked them, like, what is the difference? What are ways that I show you respect? And what would it actually, how can I make it known to you that I am in fact glad that you are my student? And so that conversation prompted many follow-up conversations, both as a class and individually. But one of the things she incorporated was some intentional journal prompts. She had these feedback, I think she called them dialogue journals, where students could write in it, she would respond, and she came up with the cadence that was manageable for that. And then also, if you wanted to take a look at some of these strategies, heart maps are also one way that she had students express what are all the aspects that make you who you are? How does that show up in the classroom? And then throughout the year, she continued to collect student input and feedback as she was making these instructional shifts. How is this landing for you? Is this valuable? What would you advise me to do differently? And that in and of itself created deeper buy-in. The idea that, like, oh, as a student, I do have some say in the way that my day unfolds. That's often not the belief. Oh, thank you, Megan. Yes, we will drop the slides in the chat for you. And so what Lori did was she first, because goal setting wasn't a practice that existed in her class yet, to keep the stakes relatively low and to build that sense of academic community, they came up first with a class goal, and then off of that class goal, they started identifying individual growth goals based on their data in those one-on-one conferences that Lori was having with them. So she shared with them in aggregate, like for their FAST scores, here's where you were in previous years. And she asked students to share a noticing, right? A see, think, wonder. And so they're like, oh, as the year went on and as the grades went on, it seems like as a group, less and less of us were meeting the national benchmark. And we want to change that as a class. She taught reading and writing for 5th and 6th grade. And so they set a grade level goal, and she did some coaching around, like, what is the balance of something that's aspirational but still achievable. And then they brainstormed what are some individual actions that each of them could take based off of their own unique strengths and challenges so that they could contribute to this class growth. And these are just some images of how she was able to operationalize that. So I would love to talk more about these individual strategies, but she and I had all year over the course of several years in the partnership to work on these things, but she sort of introduced James Nottingham's learning pit, the idea that we all struggle and it's in the struggle that we learn, and that the temptation sometimes is to just run across the bridge and avoid that feeling of, like, I don't understand this, I'm completely confused, this is out of my comfort zone, and then making transparent for students. These are all they moved and dragged their own little person in Pear Deck, so that she was sort of creating this culture of transparency around, I am struggling, there's no stigma around that. And I've made it through the struggle, and now we all celebrate because when one of us succeeds, we all feel a sense of accomplishment. And then just for visual reference, some of the ways that she really, and you have to try a couple of different strategies, right? So she tried a couple of different ways to have students identify what is the need, what is something that according to my success criteria, I'm not quite there yet. And then what are some choices I can make to work on that specific skill? So really developing that practice of intentional goal setting and reflection. And I think it's always important to connect the macro to the micro, right? So she was, this all started because the whole school was noticing differences in the way students who are part of that free and reduced lunch population were not having the same academic outcomes and the same school experience as far as like feeling positively a sense of belonging. And then there was one student in particular in her class who is part of that, that student population and sort of had a history of sometimes missing 2 weeks of school at a time. Her scores in various assessments were often below benchmark, and it wasn't uncommon to see her sometimes just put her head down on the desk and kind of check out. So she was definitely on Lori's radar. And so she tried all of these things with her. And over the course of just that one school year where she had her as a fifth grader, she noticed the student showing more investment in her learning. And then she, for the first time ever, had asked, actually, can I redo that assessment? I don't think that was my best. And so Lori was like, yes, of course. Like you're now looking at data, you care about it, and you're finding meaning in it. And it's shifting your behavior and your investment. So those one-on-one data conferences really made a massive difference for this one student. And then last year, she gave me an update because the school does looping. So she had her as a sixth grader. And so while I was no longer coaching her directly, I really appreciated the update on this one student. For the first time ever, she finished a novel. She used to go to the library, check out a book and return it and never actually open it. It was just part of the habit because the class would always, that was part of their routine. But for the first time ever, she asked to renew a book. She's like, actually, I'm reading this and I want to continue reading it. So she continued showing growth in her reading and writing skills, as well as her confidence and her social skills in that academic community that Lori was building. And so what she noticed last year is like in areas where she would have in the past shut down if something felt too hard, she now is willing to ask questions. It's not shameful anymore for her to admit that something is not clicking for me right away, or I need help with this, or I need extended time, I need to renew this book, right? So it's a culture shift, but it's also an academic outcomes shift. So I am going to look at the time. All right, perfect. So if you can think about that See, Think, Wonder protocol again. And we're going to look at the data for this particular school, their BOY, so their beginning of the year data, to their end of the year data. And those are the next few slides here. So to sort of orient ourselves, you'll see the questions here where my cursor is. And then FRL is for that population of students who qualified for free reduced lunch. And then for reference, on the right-hand side, we see the same for students who pay for lunch. And then you'll see it says winter 2021 and spring 2021. This school happened to administer their baseline survey in early January. And then the second one was at the end of the school year. Typically, schools will do it sometime in the fall and then in the spring, but we had a tighter window for them. So as you're looking, there's this domain of questions, academic mindset. So you'll see the averages for that domain and then the individual questions for that domain on the right. And then you'll see that for all of the groups of questions in the slides to follow. And then this slide is showing their NWEA math benchmark. So it's basically, you've got your first two left columns here for students in the free and reduced lunch population. On the right, students with paid lunch. And then where it says not Highlander or Highlander teacher, it's the teachers who were incorporating some of these strategies after seeing the student experience survey data, and then the teachers who weren't being directly coached or supported. And the blue sort of denotes, let me actually pull this up. Raw scores compared to the national average. So blue is students at or above the national average at that time of assessment administration. Thank you, Liz, for sharing increases in most answers for free reduced lunch students from winter to spring. Yes, indeed. Janelle, thank you. Some closing of gaps between students who are socioeconomically disadvantaged and those who are not. Ooh, Christy, excellent question. Thank you. So in the chat, she said, I wonder how the students were communicated with so they could celebrate the overall growth in addition to individual growth. So I'm going to pull this slide back here. I should grab the data from Lori for the following years, because I know that she's been tracking. So because she had the fifth graders again in sixth grade, they were able to revisit their fall, winter, and spring FAST scores from the prior year to see as a class, are we seeing growth? And I guess it's fortunate that she got to have her same group of students a second year. Not always the case, I know, but excellent question. Thank you, Christy. And Joe said, I'm seeing that paid students went down from benchmark in some areas. Yes, let me pull that up. So one of the things we noticed too is that for students who are in that sort of paid group, well, those who were working in our cohort, there's just a little bit of growth, right, in the 63% to 65% at or above benchmark. And for those in the free and reduced lunch group, there was a little bit more growth for the teachers who were working with us. But for teachers who were not incorporating some of these strategies to develop individual relationships with students and to intentionally have those conversations about building academic mindset, you do see some shrinkage here, right? Like the teachers, and across the year, there were less students at or above the national average for teachers who weren't necessarily intentionally working on some of these things. And for the paid group, it's somewhat level, a little bit of growth there as well. Any other things that you're noticing, things that you're wondering, or potential suggestions, actions you might take in response to this data? So Joe's question, how did overall GPA get impacted school-wide? That's a great question. So one of the things that the design team determines with us, so that's the teachers on the design team, parents, and school and district leaders, is like which measures are we going to use to determine whether or not what we're doing is actually improving experiences and outcomes for all students, and especially the students who were previously identified by the design team as potentially having an urgent need to have an intervention or some kind of new strategy. And so GPA was not one of their measures that the design team selected, largely because they're in the middle of a transition where they had traditional letter grades and averages, but they're moving towards more competency-based, standards-based grading. So knowing that their system was going to be changing over the next couple of years, they didn't want to use sort of the old system of averages and sort of letter grades and GPA be one of the measures. So it'd be interesting for us to see. I think for them, the academic outcomes measures that they used were standardized tests. And then the human or balance measure is the student experience survey. And they're also one of the schools that did focus groups to dig a little bit more deeply into the student experience. Bart's question about the domain composites, yes, they are just a simple average of the individual survey item scores. So oftentimes when we align this with professional development and coaching for educators, there are some strategies within that sociocultural awareness domain that really attend to several of the statements or survey items within that domain. So it's useful for them sometimes as a quick look to be able to see as a whole in this domain, are we seeing overall growth or stagnation or even a decline? And then the individual questions help us sort of look a little bit more closely at what specifically is improving. Also, I'm curious if there are any connections to folks in the Zoom. Do you do surveys like this or your own version of student experience data collection? Is it one of the considerations when you're sort of reflecting on the school year and looking at outcomes data? Or is it the case, like in many schools, where primarily our measures of success are purely standardized tests and maybe GPAs and averages? So any experiences with student surveys or otherwise collecting data about the student experience? Awesome. Thank you, Bradley. A Google form like this at the end of each semester asks about some things like this, but also how they enjoyed the curriculum. Beautiful. I'm curious and would love to know if you share your data back with students, knowing that it happens at the end of each semester, or if that sort of informs some of your future moves. What's sort of the arc of giving the survey?
So what I've done is bring it up to them the following year and say, last year you all said X, Y, and Z. So this year, this is some of the changes that we've made. Granted, this is my second year teaching, so I did that at the end of last year, and I've done it in the beginning of this year. So
Awesome.
far, so good.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that. Can I ask what grade and or subjects?
So English and writing for 9th and 10th grade primarily.
Awesome. Thank you. any other connections, ways that you've done this in your own practice, or maybe if you coach teachers, any ideas that are coming up for how you might introduce them to some of these practices of collecting and applying student input and feedback. If not, no worries. I think Bradley's example is a strong one. So one of the things that I know we often get a question about is, okay, that's great for the teachers that receive direct coaching and that were supported in this way. What about the rest of the staff and all of the students who have various teachers? And yes, Joe, I couldn't agree more. Applying what we learn is absolutely the biggest challenge, especially in the landscape of education where mandates change all the time and the environment is impacted by so many factors. And so one of the ways that we try to continually collect and apply data, there was an all staff PD at the end of the school year where folks were eager to see what has changed, if anything, from January to now by looking at the student experience data. And then the teachers themselves who worked with us facilitated a PD with their staff. And so they shared, here's what I did, here's how I responded to what I learned from the survey. So they actually talked through with their colleagues, these questions were they seemed competing to us. And this data opened up some questions. So we asked our students directly, here's the conversation we had. Here are the strategies that we incorporated and what the outcome was. So really trying to apply and scale what they were able to learn over the course of that year with the rest of the school. And so this is just a sampling of a Padlet, some things that the pilot teachers sort of took away from this experience, that we have better outcomes if we work with students' authentic motivations rather than against them. And I think especially in middle school developmentally, right? Like the idea that this is what you said, tell me what it meant and tell me what you want to happen because of it, really went very far as far as student engagement and ownership. And this other pilot teacher said, for them, as they were really focused on making a more positive collaborative culture in the school, that she noticed students felt more supported by their peers. They're very socially motivated learners, and they happen to be motivated by collective success. So for her, having a class goal was particularly meaningful and valuable. And so her suggestion was that, we share kids, right? Like my students are your students. Perhaps this is something you might want to try in your math context or in social studies, for example. So sort of giving some inroads and examples for their colleagues about ways that they can apply what they'd learned. And then in this right-hand side, these are their colleagues. What's one thing they're taking away from what pilot teachers shared, and what will be their first step going into the next school year. So you'll notice here, they appreciated the opportunity for protected collaborative time with staff. So sort of removing the silos that can sometimes happen, especially in secondary ed, where your content area is your content area and that's what you teach. And so spreading that learning about what methods are working and not working with the students that they share. And then here thinking about student ownership and how there tends to be an over prioritization of compliance, right? And that was an aha moment for these teachers. Like, how much are we spoon feeding information and knowledge and learning for our students? And how much are we asking them to be quiet, passive learners versus, the sometimes messier, often noisier approach of more constructivist collaborative education. And then really seeing the value in student voice. So similar to what Bradley walked us through, there were some teachers who said, like, I want to give my own survey about my specific things relevant to the way that I teach my class, the content that I teach, because I want students to tell me their honest opinion of what is valuable, what could use some tweaking or adjusting. And then just the emphasis on creating a community of learners and sort of destigmatizing struggle and making it normal, right? Normalizing that that's how we all learn and we can push each other and support each other through it. So it is 12:58. I will sort of just leave this text heavy slide up here for folks who maybe are thinking about at the school leadership level and district leadership level, what were some of the things that we did to sustain the improvements, the changes that we were seeing. And so these are just some leadership moves, some systems changes and like structural things that were put in place so that they could continue building off of this growth. Let's see. Yes, thank you, Mary from Aurora. There's a feedback survey in here. It's in the chat. I believe it's also on the last slide. Would love to hear from you guys. Thank you, Joe. I really appreciate it. Thank you for engaging in the conversation. And I'll be here if anyone has any questions or connections, something you're taking away from today. Thank you, Liz.